In the darkest worlds that ever were, the only thing that brings light are stories. Those stories are kept in one place, the tiny bookcase.
Hello, explorers of the Sacred Library. I'm Ben.
I'm Nico, and you're listening to the Tiny Bookcase. For this episode, we have not just one, but two guests.
Returning guests as well. They were our first two guests in Season 1, and they'll actually be our last two guests ahead of next week's season finale.
We have known them for an excruciatingly long time.
Mm.
So let's just welcome Gary Wilson.
And Brad Rawlinson.
So boys, what's it like to be back?
It's great. It's nice to be back.
I sound so sure.
Do you want to take that one again, Brad?
No, I'm leaving this in.
I was waiting for Gary to talk, and I was hoping we'd both go at the same time, but not on the same wavelength, it seems.
I'm thrilled.
Good. I think Brad might be more nervous. Brad's joined us on some Patreon content, so he knows how this goes normally.
Definitely. Well, it's good to have you guys back. How did you find it last time when you wrote, performed a story, had a bit of feedback about it, and got interviewed in Season 1?
I really enjoyed it, actually. I was very early on in the run, so I wasn't 100% sure of what to expect. I don't think you'd even released the first episode when I recorded my appearance.
That's true.
But it was very good to stretch the old writing muscles again. It had been quite a long time writing, but on my only writing had really been roleplay adjacent rather than anything that was meant to be standalone. So it's
But I think
good to do that again.
Of a lot of the guests that we've had, you've actually had some sort of formal training, I guess, because you did a lot of writing workshops at university, didn't you?
Yes, yeah. Across both attempts. I did a decent amount of creative writing, so I had some learning input, although given that my interest is generally in genre fiction, you get limited opportunities to do that at university.
They put you in the bad cupboard, don't they? If you
they really
write
do.
fantasy stories.
They don't like it at all. There was at my uni there was one tutor that was willing to mark fantasy work.
Was that Una?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Una was pretty good. Yeah, I really liked her.
Yeah, shout out to Una McCormick. She was very good.
Sure, much like Vin Diesel, Una is listening.
And Brad, how about you, man? How's it feel to be back in the hot seat?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't think I came off particularly well in the episode I was in.
Just as a little aside to listeners that remember Brad's episode in season 1, he told us that he didn't really read, which went down like a lead balloon. And for about 6 months after that episode came out, he kept messaging us saying, "Hey, hang on a sec, I read this book and I read this book. I enjoyed that and I enjoyed that. Hey guys, I read."
Doesn't really work off air though, I'm afraid, Brad.
Unfortunately not. So...
Well, I mean, I'm back on air, so this is a time to clarify that I clearly have read some books, but for some reason, when asked, I forget every single one.
I wouldn't feel so bad about it, Brad, because when I was on, Nico and I went on a big tangent about how much we liked some of the Halo books, especially those written by Karen Travis, and I found out this week that even though she is a professional author, she does not read for pleasure. She only reads non-fiction. She actually came into writing via being a news journalist.
You can read non-fiction for pleasure, I think.
I don't think that's particularly an issue. Like, if someone's a good writer, they don't necessarily need to be a good reader, I guess.
Yeah, I think the two often go hand in hand. Like you get sort of prolific writers are typically prolific readers, but it's not, as you say, 100%. It's a generalization. It's not necessary.
I won't be the only one thinking about Garth Marenghi's Dark Place here. I can say that I have written more books than I've read.
I think I can hear that copyright strike coming. That impression was too good.
It's because he's me.
Well,
I even look a bit like him. Horrible.
Only when you try.
That's true.
Well, Eustaris has been noticeably silent this season. We had him drumming us in at the start in season 1, but in season 2 we just catch him at the end. So I'll be the one to demand the stories this time. The prompt this week, and we're going to get 4 stories out of this,
Oh,
is Broken Key.
broken key. Sandra Higgins let loose a sigh that, through thousands of uses, had resulted in an optimized silent exhalation. It had been honed in such a fashion for 2 reasons. The first is that it would be unkind to whatever child was warbling their way through the scales at that particular time, and second, and possibly more importantly, because most of these children's parents were one sigh away from a Pinot Noir-fueled Google review that could end your career. Sandra had never considered herself a singer, per se. She had some ability in terms of matching key, but as one of the lecturers had told her when she auditioned for drama school, was severely lacking in any kind of oomph. They'd let her in after all that. Even prestigious drama schools need a chorus line after all, but it had been something of a nail in a reasonably small coffin. So Sandra had got a job in a pokey office in the middle of town, and spent several years filling out what the company knew as triannual finding and relevance MI reporting functionality outgraphs, and what she had come to know as a series of squiggles someone in a much nicer outfit than her was using to justify their bonus every 6 months. Eventually, when she espied an advert in the local paper selling an upright piano, one careful former owner, she had seen the opportunity to do something positive with her life. No more drudgery and grey walls. She could work at home, perhaps in the conservatory. She would find the next Adele and help them to achieve musical greatness. She did not, conversely, put any of that in her resignation letter, which she handed in as soon as the voice on the end of the phone confirmed, "Oh yes, it's still here." She had expected an old lady, but the voice that had confirmed the presence of the piano had the gruff tone of a man in his 50s, or a heavy smoker in his 30s. It was always hard to tell over the phone. Her manager had told her she could ram her notice period up her arse, which made a nice change from the things he was normally promising to ram into the revolving door of temps that came through the place. So with her head held high, enough savings for about 3 months if she was very careful and stuck to her new choice of intermittent fasting, and a post-it note with an address on, Sandra began her new life. The house she found herself outside of was decidedly creepy. In a Christ almighty, how have I never noticed that house before? It looks like it's full of dolls that murder people kind of way. But Sandra convinced herself we mustn't be judgmental. A soft tap on the door sent a thud echoing unnaturally through the building, and a long, uncomfortable moment passed before the door opened a crack. What stood on the other side of it had clearly once been a normal person, with its 2 legs and correct facial features, but it was smothered in some kind of dark, crusty business. Its eyes were darting from left to right. Yes, who are you? Who sent you? The voice confirmed it to be the man from the phone. "Hello, I'm Sandra. I called earlier about the piano." The man's eyes seemed to attempt to escape his skull before the pupils drifted to the middle to discuss their next plan of action. Yes. The piano. It's in here. Do come in. Mind your step." The decor of the house was unique, Sandra settled on. It seemed to be entirely octopus-themed. Cast iron tentacles acted as coat pegs, painted images of squid beings lined the walls. It wasn't her sort of thing, but then perhaps this man was some kind of scientist. She followed him along a series of corridors until they reached a door closed firm. "Just in here it is. You play the piano, do you?" An odd question, Sandra thought, although perhaps he knew about all those upseller people who'd been ruining the boot sales. It was so difficult to get things you wanted on the cheap nowadays. "Oh yes, I love to play." "And sing, do you?" Sandra felt a pang of sadness, the memory of youthful singing filling her. "Not anymore, though I hope to teach children." The grimy man nodded. "Yeah, That ought to do. Well, enjoy the piano. The piano, Sandra's pride and joy now, was an enormous black masterpiece, again carved about with tentacle designs, of which she'd grown rather fond, produced by the Oh Yes Relais piano company apparently. It had sat proud in her conservatory now for around 10 years, and a series of little mewling children had stood beside it and practiced their scales. At first she'd delighted in their pitchy wailings, their parents' arrogant delight. Now she felt herself numb to the joys of the music. Mechanically, day in and day out, playing up and down that keyboard for their educational purposes. She'd given up on remembering the children's names some time ago. The procession of doe-eyed little girls was endless, instead referring to them by descriptions of their parents. This morning's lesson, with stinks of gin and football tattoos, had gone smoothly enough, though the father was insisting for the 5th week in a row she should get the sheet music for I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles, so that his daughter could belt it with him. Sandra had nodded non-committally and muttered something about popping to the shops for it. The following lesson, with yoga pants and dirty beard, had been even less eventful, although their son, one of the few boys she actually taught, had seemed to hit puberty at roughly 90 miles an hour during a run-through of You Are My Sunshine. Sandra, sadly, was not able to modulate the key fast enough to keep up with his violently shifting vocal cords. And now it was Lechy Dad Instagram Mum's child. It was her first lesson, and Sandra had vowed to learn her name, which was Molly, or Millie, or Mandy, or something, possibly Emily. She realised, as she stared into the little girl's face, that it had gone a disturbing beet red, and Sandra's mind snapped back to the task at hand. She'd been so deep in thought that she'd been automatically moving up the scales as she pondered the day's work. Her hand deftly danced across the highest of keys, and her ears, foregoing their usual self-defence, swam back into the room to listen to what was happening. The child was whining at an unbelievably high pitch. The glass of the conservatory was vibrating gently as she peaked each time. The little girl's eyes darted back and forth from Sandra to her parents. Her mother, too engrossed in her phone, had yet to even look up at the child. The father had left about 10 minutes in, announcing his departure into Sandra's cleavage as though there was a microphone in there. Sandra didn't know why, but she allowed her hands to continue their dance. Up and up they went, until... there. It happened. The child reached a key just beyond human reckoning. There was a pop as the screen on her mother's phone exploded, and then whoosh! Blinding purple light fired from the piano's lid. A series of horrifying pseudopods, heaving with mass and slathered in fetid gore, slid from the wooden framework, seemingly accompanied by 1,000 eerie voices, singing in the broken key the child had achieved. Sandra watched slack-mouthed as mother and daughter were dragged screaming into the piano, before the lid closed with a soft bump. Snapping to, she glanced at her watch. 2:30. Best pop the kettle on. Talks about cricket and vegan cake recipes were coming with their little girl soon, and she'd like to try that last song. One more time.
That was great. It's like comedic Lovecraft.
Like Douglas Adams meets HP.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I loved it. Really, really liked it. I thought I didn't think there was much fat on it either. I thought that everything was very economical, but all the descriptions quite luxurious. I really, really dug that a lot. Liked it.
I think there was a bit of an effort to that this time, because I wanted to get that kind of backstory of the piano in, and it did mean having some economy with it.
Yes.
And yeah, it was challenging actually, but I enjoyed making sure I could get that whole narrative in there. That was a fun challenge.
Yeah. What did you make of it, Brad?
I really enjoyed it. I thought you did exceptionally well with the pacing of it, considering how few words sometimes these stories feel like you have.
Yeah.
With the initial description, sort of, it felt like it was going to be a very grounded story, and then the phone call with the initial yes, just immediately just oh, there's more to this. And then it built from there as every new element was added until you threw pseudopods at us, and it was like what? Yeah, I enjoyed it. Very well done.
Yeah. Were you? Was there any particular inspiration for the Cthulian piano?
So the idea started from when I thought about the broken key of it being that point where a child's voice when they go for a high note just disappears, and I thought, wouldn't it be funny if that called upon something, and
Yeah.
like people always joke that would call a dog. I thought, well, how do you turn that up to the nth degree? And it turns out that to my mind is a piano made from trees in Relais.
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 There was some great lines in there early on when you do this every week. It's fantastic. Like the way you can really just like get a description right, and it's always really flavorful and tonally correct for what you're doing. The one right at the start of the idea of avoiding Pinot Noir fueled Google reviews was very well realized, and that sort of set off a whole bunch of quite well observed realist humor. And this idea of like meaningless squiggles providing reasons for bonuses for rich people, ramming stuff up, revolving interns. I just thought it was great. Really distinct and well told.
Yeah, I really liked how you managed to sketch like quite a lot of characters in very few words that felt very true to how a disappointed piano teacher would view the people around them.
I made a specific note of Lechy Dad and Instagram Mom because that almost made me burst out laughing.
Yeah.
I really like smells of gin and football tattoos.
If anything, like so, we're making an effort to try and find things to push ourselves with in terms of like feedback and workshopping.
Yeah.
At the moment, and I thought that I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the 10-year time jump, where it sort of jolts back into the narrative present.
Yeah.
There was something about that it sort of folded into the story a bit much, a bit too much for me. But you sort of saved it by having this idea of this woman who, I mean, it didn't sound like she was ever going to be happy no matter what she was doing.
Yeah.
Really, like this idea of someone being so incapable of feeling fulfilled by their life that they weren't trying to do anything. It's exactly the right vessel for some kind of Cthulian nonsense, isn't it?
I think, with more words, I probably would have fleshed out that time a little.
Yeah,
But-
I think that's where the word count has gone against you a little bit. But that's a really minor issue in what is otherwise a really tight, well told story. But I find this when I jump around in narrative time, like you lose a big chunk of your word count doing it. But it was worth it, so I think it was the right move.
Yeah, I think I managed to find the point to get it to work. I needed it to be long enough for her to be so disenfranchised that a Cthulian beast reaching out of her piano to eat a child would be all right. I've got another one in half an hour, so I'll put the kettle on.
Yes, I mean she definitely sounded complicit by the end.
Yeah.
That she was even managing to find that element of her, that little bit of enjoyment she got from seeing something really weird happen was, it was delightful. It was a good story, man. He did really well.
I'm glad it was enjoyed.
Yeah, you could see a story about like a detective investigating disappearances, meeting her like a few years down the line after she's fed more and more parents to whatever's inside the piano.
They definitely start dating in a bar one night, don't they? And he doesn't know he's sleeping in a bed above that conservatory.
Yeah.
Oh no, it's happening. A story's being born.
Oh, part 2.
Cover your eyes.
Right, well, let's find out what the first of our guests has in store for us. Gary, I think you've got a story for us.
The Broken Key. Eric and his 3 compatriots perched on their stools, waiting for the curtain to raise. Beyond the red velvet, the cowled lord and his baying mob awaited, ready to consume the offering, and hopefully deem it worthy. To his left sat those Eric led on this day of destiny. Alan, near perfect in appearance. Unblemished skin, small, easy smile, soft, delicate brown curls, and gentle baby blue eyes. He was the boy every mother dreamed her daughter would dream of. Ashley, handsome and rugged, stubble so dark it seemed more blue than black, cheekbones that could flense a man to the bone, and a wicked mischief behind his eyes. The boy the daughters truly dreamed of. And lastly, poor Carter, pudgy where the rest were chiselled, comely where the others handsome, always uncomfortable in their chosen uniform, but filled with talent. He was the one the coward lord would notice. Eric was sure of it. To Eric's right, the coward lord's twin-headed seneschal gibbered to itself in the speech of the northern coast. One head sat on the end of a long neck with a forehead that stretched obscenely high, twice again as large as the rest of the creature's face. The other head was round and squat, jutting from the shoulder it sat upon, a sly smirk never far from its lips, laughing at its own jests in that accursed tongue. Nervously, Eric licked his cracked lips. He had left it too late to fetch another drink, and his thirst must go unquenched. The seneschal twisted towards the four of them, both heads smiling. While their speech remained unintelligible to Eric, he sensed what they meant. It was time. The curtain raised, and Eric was blinded by the glare of the lights. He could see the shadows of the mob, writhing, cheering, laughing, and jeering. The great faceless mass of them brought pressure unlike anything Eric had felt before. For a long moment, stretching from the days his ancestors crawled from the seas until the very day the stars went black, Eric did nothing. He stood aghast at the task before him, certain he would fail. Then his eyes found the coward lord in front of the crowd, eclipsing all in his majesty. Stately and unfazed, he silently raised a hand and indicated they should begin. Carter opened the song. Eric had decided they should put their best foot forward. His beautiful, soulful, powerful voice pulling the mob to quiet attention and bringing Eric back to himself. In that moment, he knew they could succeed. Carter's verse passed to Alan, then Alan to Ashley, and finally Ashley to Eric. With nary a stumble, all four delivered their verses, then joined as one to launch into the chorus. The mob broke their silence then. Joyous cheers and applause filtered down onto the stage, and though blinded by the lights, Eric swore he could see smiles on the faces of all but the coward lord. And then it was time for the key change. As one, Eric and his compatriots stood and shifted the song into the broken key. The words the same, but now spoken in the ancient speech of the first ones. Carter's voice became an undulating wail, pulsating with the very harmonics of the universe. Ashley and Alan's voices keened higher and higher, the waves of their power mingling, battling and mating above Eric's deepening baritone. His was the voice of the oceans. The mob reacted appropriately. Those in the nearest rows were obliterated immediately. Twisted blackened skeletons frozen mid-cheer, hands melded together in eternal posthumous applause. Behind, the crowd turned on each other, rending left and right with tooth and nail, battering with fists, feet, knees, and elbows. A large woman near the back screamed in joy, her maw widening, becoming a great void larger than her head had been, twisting back and inverting, her insides becoming her outsides in a wail of euphoric ecstasy. Carter's tongue stretched from his mouth as he arced back, still the centerpiece of this great and terrible chorus. Writhing and lashing like flame, the tongue became a great burning wick and Carter the candle. His eyes ran down his cheeks, and his puppy fat began to slough away like so much wax. Alan's perfect skin was tearing apart, his hair falling out in clumps and his eyes became clouded and pained. Ashley was contorting and twisting, his body too small to house the skeleton within, limbs jagged and thin. Eric himself was not spared from the twisting harmony. His was an internal change, at once aware of the universe's scale and his own place within it. A mediocre singer wailing at a vast, uncaring universe for the amusement of a crowd already dead. Amidst it all, the coward lord sat, unmoved and uncaring. Slowly, ever so slowly, as slow as the turn of galaxies, he raised a hand and the music stopped. A long, exasperated sigh escaped from his dry mouth, long devoid of any feeling or joy, long devoid of life. His sigh was that of an ancient tune opening to the wind. At last, he spoke. Well, it was far from the worst audition we've had on the unknowable symbol factor, but your harmonies are off in the key change. I'm sorry, but it's a no from me. Fuck, thought Eric. It's Butlins for us.
For fuck's sake!
The coward lord. Oh, that was excellent. What a good little turn at the end after like a truly overblown set of descriptions that were really fun to listen to. Like that was a crescendo of description, wasn't it?
I was trying to write some down and couldn't keep up.
I will live forever haunted by the phrase "his body too small for the skeleton within." I don't like that. No.
It was the twin-headed gibbering seneschal that really got me going.
What you mean, Ant and Dec?
Yeah.
Away. So the first one I wrote down was cheekbones that could flens a man to the bone. I thought, oh, that's really rich. I really like that. And then you just started rapid firing these beautiful little turns of phrase at me. And I thought, I'm just going to stop fucking writing them down now. Very similar experience to what Brad just described of, I can't keep up with this. Just want to enjoy it. I don't want to be stopping to write anything down because I fear I will miss something.
Definitely. Was the actual line cheekbones that would flens a man to the bone?
Yeah.
Because just a small note there, like cheeks that could flens a man to the bone might work.
Yes, rather than cheekbones. Yeah.
But there were loads of really good turns of phrase, like as the other guys have said, like it was just rapid fire.
Absolutely took me out of left field with the turn as well. I was not expecting a gag like that at the end. Just
I was expecting a gag, but I wasn't expecting that gag.
So the gag came first. Like the punchline was kind of the idea. So I came at it from a similar angle from Nick, where like it was the idea of a key change, or like a key, like a musical key. I thought was less obvious. Like I was like, for a while, I was thinking about like someone trying to escape from a dungeon or something, you know. And I was like, no, this is just too much like a point and click adventure. And I was like, oh, music. And then the main thing I know about key changes not being as musically inclined as Nick is that boy bands do them by standing up.
Oh, I see.
I absolutely love that and if it then goes on that we now have 2 more stories about Cthulian music, I might just die. But I love that we both thought, oh yeah, music's an interesting take on this. What if it was eldritch music? We are kindred spirits, you and I, Gary.
That is why my lead was called Eric. That was inspired by the strange music of Eric Zahn.
Eric Zahn, yeah. I nearly mentioned Eric Zahn in your story, in the discussion about your story, Nick, actually.
Yeah.
Because that's just a cracking story. How fascinating. They're also both contained mediocre singers as well, didn't they? Like this idea of someone being very self-aware about the limits of their talent and finding it crushingly awful that is the case. I would also say I got like an Umbrella Academy sort of vibe to it. With the descriptions of like how powerful, how music can be sort of weaponized. I think there was one about the chubby lads becoming like a wick for the flame. That sort of really sank in for me. And then also, I don't know if you've either read the book or seen the movie, but there's a book called Perfume: The Story of a Murderer. And there's it's the idea that like perfume can just drive people insane or whatever, or do different things. And there's a scene in that movie that this like orgiastic violence and people like melting and stuff reminded me really strongly of, which was really cool. I dug it, and I also dug the turn. I thought it was very funny.
It was a fun one to write because like I knew that I was just getting to go wild with descriptions a little bit to sort of hide the turn from coming.
Yeah.
The only bit, so I was a little apprehensive about the term actually saying the unknowable symbol factor in the Coward Lord's line. I didn't know if that would be too on the nose.
I think it works.
That was. I almost lost the joke
Yeah.
with that line.
It would possibly work better in print if you just did put a weird symbol in the middle of it.
Yeah. I think it was just because it was being said like a punchline, because it was a punchline.
Yeah.
For it to be a symbol that you have to try and say, it possibly trips you up a little bit, maybe. What did you think, Brad?
I mean, I'll admit I actually did not pick up on that joke until you just mentioned it.
Right.
I think because it was multiple words, I sort of just assumed it was a reference to something that I didn't know because, yeah,
You don't read books?
And so it begins again.
Well, to his credit, watch the X Factor.
I mean, you could always, if you wanted to keep the sort of Cthulian vibe, you could always switch that with something like Innsmouth's Got Talent, or
Yes, that might work better.
Yes.
Yeah,
There you go.
Innsmouth's Got Talent.
That's a great change. Also, I think it probably should be, rather than raised, I think it should be waiting for the curtain to rise, and the curtain rose. I think in both of those instances you use raised.
Yeah.
Which didn't quite work.
I'll say, if I'm certain of nothing else, it's that we had two very similar takes on the idea, but mine was directed by Edgar Wright and yours was Guillermo del Toro.
It was a really good story, man. Well done.
Yeah,
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Now, Brad, if you can summon your reading ability for long enough to plough through what you've written for us.
I
mean it not.
Pack up and leave.
I promise for all of you listening, I miss Bradley dearly, and I love him with all of my heart.
It's coming from an affectionate place, isn't it, Nick?
Let's have your story, man.
Dingly dangly dong.
That's a new one.
It sure is. Hello, story seekers. Look, normally we would put an ad in here, but we are instead barging in like we own the place.
Because we want to ask you for a favour.
Well, two favours, really. It's a bit cheeky, I know. We love writing our stories, and we want as many people as possible to hear them. So what we're asking is if every one of you out there listening could tell a friend about us. Play or link them to your favourite story, and bring them into your Steris' sacred library.
Secondly, if you enjoy the podcast, then you can actually help us make it by joining us on Patreon. There are bonus episodes, cool badges, and even a chance for an exclusive t-shirt with some of Nico's art on it. The link for that is in the episode description of every episode.
And thank you all for listening. It's been an incredible journey so far, and we can't wait to do more.
Now, back to business. Let's have another story.
Bingle bangle, wingle, wangle?
The Broken Key. Friends, we all knew this day would come. From the moment we began our journey in Vraenor, the Elven Realm, to the crossing of the Salt Mountains, to our descent into the depths of Guthrek, there was never a doubt in our minds that we would one day be sat around a campfire as we are now. A decision needs to be made. The future of our world depends on it. I am talking, of course, about the fate of the key. Alakar drew his hand away from his body and cast it towards the outskirts of the camp, gesturing for the eyes of his companions to follow. In the overgrowth, at the far edge of the clearing, the sleeping form of Bundor the Elfling could be seen swaddled in a stone-weave cloak. Rothrock was the first to respond. I have sworn, by all the gods we dwarven folk know, that I would accompany the key until he fulfills the prophecy. I knew that this quest would not be easy, nor would it be kind. But I confess, I did not truly know the horrors we would endure. We are barely a ways into our journey, and it is already too much. Tears began to roll down the scarred cheek of the mighty dwarf. Those who knew Rothrock well But no, he was not one for weeping. But his 3 companions did not judge him. They too understood the torment he spoke of all too well. Alakar put his hand upon the shoulder of his oldest friend. We cannot abandon our mission, Rothrock. If Bondor does not reach the Palace of the Dark King, this age of shadow may never end. A gentle nod informed Alakar that the dwarf would not flee from his duty. Beyond the flames of their campfire, Kitram, Princess of the Fae, had been studying the conversation between the man and the dwarf carefully. At last she spoke. None of us could have ever imagined the true cost of this mission. We set out from Vraenor with 8 in our company, and only we remain. How much longer do you think it will be before we too fall prey to the darkness? The 4th member, Peridus, shook his head in dismay. As pained as I am to say it, Kitram, my brother is correct. Bundor is the key, and must complete his journey, if we ever hope to see our world restored. He paused to allow the princess to process his words. She too nodded in agreement. Peridus shifted his gaze back to the elfling beyond the firelight. But I confess, I too fear this undertaking will be the end of us all. We cannot continue as we are. A moment of silence fell upon the group. Then we are agreed, Alakar said, looking to each of the 3 companions in turn. The journey must continue, and the prophecy must be fulfilled, no matter the cost. He paused. That being said, I too am afraid. I have fought the legions of the Dark King my entire life. I have ventured beyond the living lands onto the fields of the fallen and beyond. I have slayed ogre, dragon, gorgon, every beast that the darkness has ever grown. But none of that prepared me for this. I was not ready to escort such a revolting, insolent, unsufferable cretin as Bundor the fucking elfling. It puzzles me, Peridus interjected, pressing his fingers into his thick brow, how a being so repellent was not slaughtered by his own kind long ago. Most elvish folk hold life in high regard, Rothric said. So my assumption would be that any who felt inclined to tear the throat away from that cancerous wretch would have swiftly relocated. I confess, if it were not for the fate of my people and the good peoples of our world, I would have stomped his face into the root of a particularly stubborn tree within hours of the commencement of our journey. Kitram spat on the earth beneath her feet. Rothrock stroked his long beard and fixed his gaze on Bundo. I don't recall there being anything in the prophecy stating that the key has to be, alive. The intent behind Rothrock's eyes made Alakar a little uneasy. Verandor would not have supported such an act. He knew the role the key must play and would never put him in such danger. Rothrock shrugged. Perhaps he would have considered it if he had known the truth of his own end. Alakar was reminded of the last moments of the mighty sorcerer Verandor, crying out in surprise as he and the rope which formerly held his weight plummeted into the chasm of the 11 hells. I'm the key, not the winch, Bundor had said as he massaged the palms of his hands. Perhaps Verandor could have saved himself had he possessed his wand, but alas, not all elflings can differentiate between magical artifacts and firewood. Surely we could alleviate some of the horrors of the journey with a simple gag, Kitram proposed, thinking about how sturdy the fabric of her stormweave cloak was that the elfling had borrowed. I've seen that creature bite through ropes like they were cheese, Rothric said, shuddering. A gag will not hold the suffering at bay for long. Kittram's head dropped again. If only Melchiah were here. He always knew what to do. It was true that his scholarly background gave Melchiah a certain aptitude for innovation. It was, of course, very hard to outthink an arrow piercing your brain. Maybe if Malchiah had known to watch for projectiles coming from behind him, he may have been alive to advise them now. Still, at least Malchiah had a quick death. Poor Liliana. After she found herself lost in the caverns beneath Guthrak, with only Bundor by her side, she took it upon herself to ensure his survival. Every drop of water she had, every chunk of stale bread, she donated to Bundor. As she withered away and collapsed, never to be found by another living soul, she took Bundor's hand and urged him to continue, begged him to fulfill his duty. Fate would have been kind to let her die 5 minutes sooner, so she did not have to witness Bundor drawing from his pack a wineskin of elvish root water, a miracle concoction of which every drop keeps you hydrated and fed for days. Liliana was too weak to ask for some, and Bundor too busy walking away swigging from the skin to see her hope die along with her body. The debate over what to do with the elfling continued for some time. They discussed what actions could be taken, what routes would minimise the threats he posed, how best to preserve their sanity. The mood swiftly fell when it became evident that there was no correct course of action. Finally, Alucard spoke up. If we allow his wretchedness to halt us now, then all our friends died for nothing. Alucard paused, allowing his words to resonate with the weary adventurers. The heroes of old myths and legends also went through struggles and hardship, but it was by overcoming these struggles that they accomplished their goals and truly made a difference in the world. A smile, rare in recent days, crossed the face of Peridus. He rose to his feet and filled his lungs with the night air. I am with you, brother, to the ends of this world and beyond. He drew his greatsword and held it aloft over the flames between them all. As am I. Kittrim stood upright as well, drawing her curved blade and meeting Peridus's. Rothrock used his mighty axe to push himself to his feet and, once rooted, he held it out in front of him over the campfire. No matter the cost, I will see it done. Alucard smiled, his faith restored once more. He drew his long sword and brought it forward to meet his companions. For a moment, the mission did not seem hopeless. The warm steel clanged together. Bundor bolted upright with a shrill screech, his head and eyes darting around until they settled on the company gathered around the fire. Do you fucking mind? Bundor shouted, loud enough to inform any nearby foes of their exact location. I don't know what you reprobates get up to when the sun has set, and frankly, I don't care. Just keep your fucking voices down and let me sleep. My apologies, Bundor, Alucard said graciously, avoiding eye contact with the elfling and instead staring past him into the shadows. We will be more careful not to wake you in future. I should think so, snorted Bundor. I am the key after all. I am the important one. As that old wizard said many times, you're all expendable. I'm not. Verandor's words were closer to protect the key at all costs, even with your lives, but they could unfavourably be interpreted in a different way. Bundor lay back down and turned away from the group, muttering racial slurs under his breath. Over by the campfire, even the wind had ceased its blowing, concerned that a light gust would shatter the fragile equilibrium. Alucard's fingers were white as the leather wrapping on his sword's hilt created an impression on his palm. Rothrock stared into the flames, wondering whether plunging his head into the embers right now would be a kinder fate. Kittrim had to consciously relax her clenched jaw lest her teeth shatter. Peridus repeated a beautiful poem his mother had taught him in his head, so the vivid images of just how he would murder the elfling would be less prominent. It was a long way to the Dark King's palace. A long, 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 long way.
Well, that was fucking hilarious, Brad.
It's really
Oh my
funny.
god.
That
Bunghole the Elfling is a vile character.
Bundor wouldn't have got far without his Sam.
a bit of a background to this idea. I specifically wanted to write something that was comedy and something that involved a conversation because they're two things I don't think I can write.
Right.
Which is why the entire thing was a conversation and why I was trying to go for a comedic angle.
I think you just proved that you can do that. That was
Yeah, you absolutely nailed both.
It was like gut burstingly funny. That like I had to mute myself multiple times, but you still got me. Like 8 times you got me. Oh god, that was so funny, man.
I'm guessing it's been edited out, but there were several moments I couldn't read because I was giggling to myself.
Just for that, I'll leave at least one of them in. For you.
This I had written down like I wrote down on my little notepad, man, this is high fantasy as fuck. What the fuck's going on? Like really near the start because that old fantasy thing of like I would say a trope of like fantasy that I don't like very much, where the first 5 pages is just a list of names.
Yes.
And I thought you nailed that as a parody.
Yeah, I specifically wanted to cram in as much like high fantasy crap at the start as possible, so I could then turn it on its head.
Yeah, similar to Ben, one of my first notes was feels very D&D.
Yeah, D&D is the same thing I wrote down.
But it did feel like for the first until the like glorious turn that was like a big release when we first find out about what Bundle's like this obnoxious self-obsessed little twat is like with the death of not Gandalf.
He was a winch.
He was originally called Vethrandor, and I was like bit too close.
But the whole time, like up to about that point, it was like you put your hands down my pants and were just muttering in broken Tolkien to me.
Tolkien and me.
But yeah, big Council of Elrond vibes, big Amon Hen vibes when they decide to go after the hobbits. That was just that was hilarious. A bitching session around a campfire in a high fantasy session.
I think one of the things that made it work so well is, like Gary said, with it feeling like D&D, you really set the tone of, and I do not mean this to be insulting in any way, so do not take it like that, but like a bad GM knocking off Lord of the Rings.
I was trying really hard to do that. So that's a compliment.
You absolutely fucking nailed it. And it put me in this situation where I was listening and having that kind of uneasy feeling. Like, we all tabletop roleplay, and if you join a group that isn't us guys, and you think a session starts, and you think, oh, this is gonna be fucking terrible. This is gonna be so bad, and I've committed to at least 6 hours of it.
I went back through and added phrases like Princess of the Fae and the Age of Shadow, just because I was like, I got to really nail. I was hoping that I'd get to the twist, and as you guys have said, you'd be like, oh god, what's he writing?
Yeah,
why is it so generic?
I am not going to lie, I was like, has he written something really shit? Like, what happened? This doesn't seem like Brad at all.
I was definitely there. I was like, oh god, are we...
I don't even play this off at the end.
It definitely, like, I've got the same vibes, like, when you were first starting, like, what you were trying to do of, like, evoking this generic fantasy, and like, with the names thing that Nick said, there's a George R. R. Martin short story where he reintroduces a space pope, and there's just a page of titles for this space pope. Oh, it also reminded me, the Tesco in my hometown used to do, like a charity bookcase. So that people would donate books, and you could put £1 in the pot and like 50p take a book. And every time I went and did my big shop, I'd go to that thing, and I'd be like, any fantasy or sci-fi novel that was on there, I'd just be like, I'll give this a shot. So I've read the first chapter of a lot of terrible fantasy novels.
Are you about to say Sword of Shannara?
I have not read that one. No.
Oh man,
that was the one I was thinking of when I made the comment about pages and pages of names,
incomprehensible names, letters that don't go next to each other. Yeah.
Now I have heard that people really love that series, and I have heard that it gets a lot better. But I bounced off the first 10 pages of that book.
Me too.
Maybe 3-4 times, and I was bouncing, Brad. I was bouncing off your story, and then you made it hilarious. The bit where he pops up and it's like, do you fucking mind? Just Oh my god. Hilarious.
Yeah,
And
in
then,
a
like,
short
muttering
spa-
racial slurs to himself. Oh, what a horrible little prick.
in a very short space of time, you manage to get shields down before then hitting the jokes.
Yeah.
So it's quite tricky when you're doing that sort of pastiche.
It's actually, and I feel I shouldn't use the term, but it's masterful the way that you completely disarmed us by going into a genre that we all know extremely well, and like in a way stamping our expectations down, so that when we were all in that moment of what is happening, and he didn't actually say anything about the key having to be alive, did he? And we all went, oh no. This is something else.
That was one of the first lines I thought of. Just this idea that they're so done with him that someone's like, we could just carry him there dead.
Bundor calls for aid.
There's just this.
And
There's
no
this
one will
pervasive.
answer.
It's such a pervasive trope in fantasy of the chosen one. I just like the idea of the chosen one being a prick.
Well-
and you can't do anything about it.
It's interesting that you mentioned Chosen One, because I was also getting strong Harry Potter vibes off that little bastard.
Yeah. It was very Lord of the Rings based when I wrote it, because as Ben knows, I've recently read Fellowship of the Ring for the first time.
Yeah.
So the whole like Counts of Elrond vibe was something that I specifically was aiming for.
Yeah.
But then I wanted to make sure that it didn't seem like it was too much just Lord of the Rings, so I tried to make it a bit more generic than that.
Yeah.
This guy, Bundor, definitely pissed in Goldberry and stole Tom's wellies, didn't he?
Yeah, I think interpreting the idea of like key as like a chosen one person was quite an interesting way to take the prompt as well into that.
And
like,
metaphorically broken as well.
stage.
He originally had a broken leg that he was pretending was injured. I cut that out for time. He also had another elfling companion that I was going to do a twist on the whole Sam and Frodo in the boat thing to say that he'd let his mate drown.
Just put his hand on the top of his head.
I felt like you had just the right amount of jokes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think any more and it would have been overblown. But it was, that was spot on. Really well done.
Thank you.
And you managed to do like a wave really well of not Aragorn being like, no, come on, weapons up, we can do this all together. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, they've reconciled, and then immediately shut the fuck up from Bundle. Just wonderful. I'm really genuinely impressed. Absolutely loved it, man.
Right. Well, there's only one story left, and it's mine.
There is. Are you ready, Ben?
I shall begin to read momentarily. Broken key. It would not be lifted, and I could not cut it open. You tried. You're a madman. Charles gawped as Dunn shrugged in response. Then his curiosity climbed up his throat. What did you use? Pull saw. The wood wouldn't be bit. It's wood. That's odd. Dunn shrugged again to indicate that this was indeed the case, and perhaps Charles should catch up. Charles had rapidly learned to translate the surly Suffolk-born Dunn's shrugs in the mere hours he had known the man. Dunn was a large bloke nearing middle age. His chest hair was sodden with river water and sweat, and Charles could see that the undershorts he wore beneath his diving gear was also drenched. A moment of fear shot through him at the thought that Dunn may have caught him looking, and Charles felt sweat burst from his brow. The two Englishmen stood at the edge of their riverside camp. Charles looked away as the large diver hung his rubberized canvas suit to dry between two stout poles. The massive bulk of the Euphrates flowed past them, and the sunlight glanced from its surface in flashes of shimmering turquoise. On the far bank, the ancient and abandoned fortress of Rumkala blended seamlessly with the ruddy cream-coloured rocks of the outcropping on which it sat. Charles finally found the courage to look back at Dunn. The big man did not appear to have registered Charles's indiscretion, and had instead gotten on with drying himself off and pulling on dry clothes. How many times have you been down? Continued Charles. Thrice. Once the look, once the lift, once to cut. And you trust these men? Aye. They're Cretan Turks, and as such, displaced. If we die, They don't get paid. You speak Greek? Dunn shrugged again to indicate he had a little of the language. Then tell them to prepare a second air pump. You have a spare suit, I presume? I do. But I'd recommend you not be in it. 'Tis a heavy job, and one that requires experience. Dunn's words came with a heavy stare. I must see it. I've not travelled 4,000 miles in ridiculous tin-rattle planes to sit and watch the river pass me by. Besides, you need the key, and I've been given the sole responsibility of it by the museum. That's so. Charles had been watching the big man's shoulders, but this time they gave nothing away. It is. So tell the men to prepare for a second diver, please. I'll accompany you on your next foray. With the delay, the next dive won't be till morning. All for the good. I need to rest in any case. The Cretan Turks Dunn had hired for the job had made the camp well, and Charles found that in the shade of his spacious tent they had already laid on food for him. He made his meal of the meat and rice parcels which had been wrapped in vine leaves and stewed with sour plums before chasing it with the whiskey he had bought in Istanbul. Charles thinned the drink out with the ice the Cretan Turks provided him and watched the day die through the open flap of his tent. The setting sun stretched the shadows of their peaked tents like accusing fingers towards Rumkala. That brazen last light seemed to make the fortress glow, and Charles recalled an earlier reference to it in Akkadian as the Golden Fortress. Charles felt the aches of travel melt from him as he sat in his canvas camp chair and celebrated the feeling by pouring himself a stiffer drink. He eyed the closed tent that belonged to Dunn warily and let his imagination conjure what could happen if he visited the man in the night. Smiling coyly to himself over yet another drink, Charles turned on the oil lamp which hung from a pole in the tent and pulled out his annotated translation of the epic. Along with it, he brought the box that contained the key. He carelessly allowed the satchel he had carried them in to thump to the tent floor as he balanced the box on his knees and thumbed through the text. Break in the doors of hell and bring up the dead to eat food like the living. Charles read aloud. His brow creased in sluggish thought. He set the book aside and flipped open the lid of the box. Within, wrapped in canvas, then in silk, was the key. It was somehow immediately recognizable as a key when Charles held it, despite its strange composition and shape. The oversized thumb grip held a broad shank that collared into double thickness at the throat, where a triple-pronged set of wards was set into the nose of the key. The entirety of the thing had been fashioned from lapis lazuli, and was thought to be nearly 5,000 years old. The pure blue was marred only by a slight mottling of white, through which golden veins spread. Charles handled it lovingly, and stared at it for some time, before retiring to his camp bed for the night. The heat of the morning pulsed through the walls of the tent, and Charles felt the thumping pain begin behind his eyes as he found consciousness. Dehydrated, he sought about the tent for the ewer the men had provided him with, and drank off a glass of the stuff, before realizing that he could hear shouting. His nightclothes still sticking to him, Charles swept outside to find that the Cretan Turks were desperately pulling at the rubber air tube that sprouted from one of their pumps, as though it were a rope. Charles looked along its length to where he could see Dunn was splashing in the current of the Euphrates, holding onto the other end and without his suit on. Without thinking twice, Charles bent his back with the men and hauled on the tube. Inch by inch, they dragged Dunn back to the bank, where other men caught him up under his arms and lifted him clear of the water. The large man Charles had admired the day before had been transformed by his ordeal. His shoulders sagged and his eyes were wide. He seemed unable to close his gaping mouth after vomiting what appeared to be silt from the river. The mud had stained his chattering teeth, and Charles could not make out any words, though he was sure that the previously taciturn man was trying to communicate with him. The men carried the crazed Dunn away to his tent, and Charles felt a sudden surfeit of fear come upon him. He raced back to his own tent and grabbed at the lid of the box. Within, only the canvas and silk wrap remained. A gunshot rang out through the camp, and Charles once more found himself running, this time into Dunn's tent. He tore aside the flap and stared at the tableau within. The Cretan Turk stood around Dunn in horror. The big diver was propped up in his camp chair, and from his limp hand hung a revolver. The man had clearly pressed it under his chin before firing. Charles could see his chest was still rising and falling. Each exhalation was accompanied by a low scream, that caused the other men to shudder. Charles quickly stepped up. He took the revolver from Dunn's unresisting hand and, without a pause, finished what the man had begun. Silence hung in the gunpowder-scented tent until Charles broke it. "Prepare the second suit," he said, softly. Within a few minutes, the shaken men had helped Charles into Dunn's spare suit and attached to it a functioning second pump. The rubberized canvas that encased him caused him to sweat immediately, and Charles found he could barely shuffle himself forwards in the weighted boots. Finally, they lifted the bronze helmet onto him and secured it in place. Charles felt the weight of the Euphrates pull against him as he walked along the line Dunn had pegged out during his first dive. The water level rose up him as he sloshed forwards, and he found himself unnecessarily holding his breath as he finally submerged his helmeted head. Exhaling, his breath rang out in the metal interior, and Charles had to master himself through a fit of hyperventilation. Onwards, he went through the deep green of the river, his air being pumped through the rubber pipe that attached to the rear of the helmet. Then he saw it. A dull nimbus of grey light hung around the open door. The massive thing had been set into the riverbed, and Charles approached it with awe spreading through his mind. The door appeared to be made of cedar wood, but was untouched by the rot that would have set in almost immediately. Upon it was carved the figure of a man, but with the legs and horns of a bull. "Enkidu," muttered Charles to himself in his metal confinement. Charles stepped heavily around the door and looked down. An opaque rectangle lay before him, and the surface appeared to be made from nothing but textureless dim light. It was unlike anything he had seen before, and his curiosity swelled. Awkwardly, Charles knelt down and laid his hands either side of it, before lowering his head through the light. The liminal space flashed through his helmet for a moment, and then Charles stared at the strangeness his eyes found on the other side. The world seemed somehow canted, with the floor before him where perhaps a wall should have stood. This misaligned space brought on a bout of vertigo for Charles. He swallowed it, and saw Dunn's discarded diving suit and helmet where it lay next to the entrance. Beyond that, the light from the door gave away very little. He began to see that the air was filled with dust motes, and as his eyes grew used to the darkness, the shadows resolved into the shapes of people. Too many to count. They were all on their hands and knees. Their bodies were constantly moving with the same slow motion which they all repeated. Each of them scraped at the clay mud beneath them and brought up a handful of the stuff. Bringing it to their desiccated mouths, they ate it. Clumps of clay were chewed and swallowed as their hands went down to fetch more. The steady mastication caused maggots to work loose from their noses and the cavernous sockets that once held their eyes. The grubs fell to the floor, where they seemed to sink through the clay. The thick mud reformed from the wounds gouged into it by the shoveling hands of the people, in time for the cycle to repeat. Upon realizing what he was seeing, Charles felt his bile rise in horrid sympathy. Then he saw the other shapes, seemingly made of darkness. Their outline was like that of a feathered bird, and their many limbs trailed over the backs of the damned. They were coming for him. Charles yanked his head back through the doorway. Desperately, he clambered to his feet, and, as the river pushed past him, he moved as quickly as he could back around to the other side of the massive cedar wood door. Charles set his shoulder to it, and the heavy thing slowly closed, snuffing out the nimbus of grey light. In the near darkness, he located the lapis key by noticing where the streaks of gold caught what little light there was at the river's bed. With an effort and thickly gloved fingers, he turned it and felt the ancient occult mechanism lock into place. Charles withdrew the key and began trudging back along Dunn's route. Within the hour, Charles was packed and ready to leave. One of the men would act as his driver to Ankara, and from there he would find a plane to take him to Istanbul. After that, he wasn't sure what his plans would be, but simply knew he needed to be away from what lay beneath the shadow of Rumkala. He had paid the Cretan Turks double their fee, and managed to communicate with them that they should bury Dunn at the earliest opportunity. Before leaving the camp, Charles took Dunn's big revolver and used the heavy butt of it to smash the key into shards and dust. He took those pieces to the bank of the Euphrates and tossed them into the water without a second thought. As the car rattled away over the rough ground, Charles took care not to look back. He held the rapidly depleting bottle of whiskey in shaking hands and swore to himself never to tell a soul about the vault of the damned.
That's actual horror.
Yeah, that was very unsettling.
Oh,
I'm starting to feel like Brad was in the wrong because the Eldritch has been strong with this episode, but never as strong as in the feathered bird, many-limbed forms of whatever the fuck was in the bottom of that river.
the line that got me, and I think it's specifically because of the way you tell your stories, Ben, is after you describe this scene and then mention these feathered birds clambering over, you said in a very sort of calm way that they were coming for him.
Mm.
And because of like just that sent a shiver down my arms. I was like, oh god, just the mental image of the just getting into that situation, taking in the sights, and then realizing what was coming.
After you go, please.
I was really uneasy when Charles went down because of the fucking degradation of Dunn. Like the way that you had him described from Charles's quite sexualized view of him, and like that sort of like taciturn nature to him, to then end up like he did was very foreboding.
Yeah,
What
I
was going to
nearly.
come next?
I very obviously that story was a lot longer than the previous ones we've had tonight. That's the longest story I've ever put into the podcast. I tried to cut it, but I just sort of couldn't cut the bit. Like it seemed like the obvious thing to cut was the one-sided sexual tension. But I think it's quite important in how you get to know Charles.
Yeah.
And then this idea of sort of like stiff upper-lipped Englishman that's going to step up and pull that trigger. But he could only do it when after this guy had lost his sexual appeal. Like it was very messed up. Like
Yeah. I will say there is an additional layer of weight to that story, having experienced a lot of your work before, because so much of it is based in history. Well, not so much of it, because you like to write stories that have this kind of facts built in. When you were talking about ancient places, and my mind immediately made it real, because so much of what you write is well researched and well informed. So when that then turned, it made the unreal more real for me. So, listen, I'd be genuinely interested to know if any listeners had that same experience of it being more realized because of how intricate the detail of your work can be. That, yeah, big selling point for me.
it's an interesting point. I mean, obviously there is some real stuff in there.
Of course.
Like this fortress of Rumkala is a real place on the Euphrates. I think Rumkala means Roman castle, Roman fort.
Okay.
And it's basically been held for centuries. And the whole this epic that he's talking about, when Charles is reading, is the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yes.
And Enkidu was Gilgamesh's like rival and mate, and they refer to the afterlife, this horrible fate that Enkidu suffers, as being a house of dust, where like the denizens of this hell are forced to I think it's eat clay and drink stone or something like that.
Oh,
So yeah, it has some roots in already existing myth and legend, like sort of Mesopotamian, Sumerian stuff, which is all freaky as hell. Oh, and the other thing is that they it's really odd. Like for example the bird thing that you mentioned, with the feathers.
Yeah.
From that depiction of hell. Like for whatever reason, they just put feathers on people.
Oh.
And it's so unsettling because it's kind of funny, but it's also just bizarre. So I kind of turned it into a not funny version of that to make it a bit more foreboding.
No, I think it's part of your toolkit that you use extremely well and used incredibly well in that story. That grounding. I think you're very good at using those little bits of like knowledge that you have to lay foundations for your stories.
It's very kind.
It's just something I've noticed. But yeah, it is kind because I like being kind to you now and again. But it means that you can there's gravitas to it. You can feel the history, and in a way, for me, because I didn't know about any of that, any of the stuff you've just explained to us, meant that the sense of mystery was greater as well in that story. And yeah, everyone, I've got to tell you, all three of you, Ben, you absolutely managed to nail that unease and the creeping dread, unsettling horror element. Brad, yours was absolutely hilarious, and Gary, you had one of the finest rug pulls after an intense roller coaster of phantasmagoria. I'm so impressed. I'm gonna say on mic, we said before this, we're old friends. We've done the podcast together before. Gloves off. If there's anything we really feel like we can dig into this week, we should do it. And everyone brought their A game. Well done, big well done from me.
I thoroughly agree. That being said, though, was there anything that that could be cut? Was there any fat that was obviously could be removed? Any clumsy turns of phrase?
I really don't think so. If anything, I would have preferred that story as a longer form piece of fiction. I think the concept was good enough that it probably could have done with maybe another 1,500 words. Like pushing the limits of short fiction instead of, just above Flash and into the bottom of short.
Yeah,
I think it had legs.
I think also it is a bit of a flaw because that's not the first time that I've done something like this on the podcast, where I think sometimes you kind of need to know when a story's too big for Flash to very, very short stories.
Yeah.
And if you can't achieve it in 1,500 words or less, then maybe you need to write something else and just shelf it. But that was well over the word count, and it still felt like it needed to be expanded more in order to work properly for me.
Dare I add? I will ask. How far over were we?
600 words.
Okay, that's not a phenomenal amount, and I think between us we had 600 words to lend, so we'll let you have those.
It's the most I've taken the piss with the word count. By a country.
I'm just gonna pick 600 words at random out of the story and edit them out.
Yeah, just
random middle sentences.
It's that sort of creeping dread horror. I think needs more time, doesn't it? You need to.
Yeah, I think any element of that you removed would have taken away from the final result, because in order to remove 600 words, you've had to remove a chunk, and it would have been either part of the description of, say, the key, or the description of what happened to Dunn. Any of those things gone would mean that we'd have lost something. So I agree with Nick.
As you say, though, yeah, that may mean it's possible that creeping dread isn't quite the right thing for this level of Flash and short fiction, just because have you got time to creep? Or have sprinting dread.
Have a sprinting dread. I think it would definitely take a better horror writing isn't something that I do a lot of.
Yeah.
So that I felt quite clumsy with the tools of horror when I was writing that. So I suspect someone, we've had Ben Langley on the podcast before, and he writes a lot of horror and he reads a lot of horror. I suspect they could really nail an 800-word flash fiction creeping dread story.
Yeah.
But I'm just gonna have to write more of them, I think. So there we go.
I attempted horror in my first appearance on this.
You did, yeah.
I tried to do it through short sentences and pacing, the way I told the story, and I think it to me it felt like an interesting way of doing it, but I didn't think it wasn't particularly scary. It was just more suspense.
Yeah,
I would say
it's definitely a hard thing to get right. I think some people just have a natural inclination for it and nail it.
Yeah.
But yeah. No, just on what would you cut from it, sort of thing. When you mentioned for example, you said if you lost the key description, you'd lose something. I think my description of the key is actually one of my favorite things that I've written for the podcast. I really enjoyed that massive overblown sentence of describing a key.
I was going to ask, because you said how the location and the I guess the mythology behind the underworld area came from something. Was the key inspired by a particular object?
No, not particularly. The idea, the lapis lazuli is a sort of, it's a semi-precious stone from that area of the world, so it sort of made sense that that could be that was like an odd material, but linked to that Euphrates Sumerian area. But no, the key is completely fictional. The door being made of cedar wood has a link to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
So there's sort of bits like that are attached to what I've done, but obviously there's no. Oh, and also the idea of river burials. They would dam rivers and bury people in the river and then undam them, basically.
Oh.
So yeah, it's sort of playing with it, really. I was aiming initially for like an almost more like like the movie The Mummy.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was aiming for something a bit like that when I started writing, and it just sort of got creepier and creepier as I
I
was
don't
writing.
think you completely missed out on that. I think I was getting a bit of that vibe. Like I was picturing that sort of aesthetic. Initially, when we were just getting like the adventure side of it with Charles and Dunn interacting.
The
Yeah,
Mummy
no,
also, the Mummy does also strafe that line, at least in the opening few scenes, with suspense and horror and comedy.
Yes.
Not that you went for comedy, but it's
I get you. Yeah.
yeah.
No, I tend not to go for comedy because I'm not very funny, Brad. Unlike you.
It would seem that something in the phrase "broken key" has triggered a Eldritch vibe for the week.
I find it fascinating that only one of them had a key, like a physical key.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I got I also thought, musical key. And I also thought like a key in basketball.
Yeah.
Keys on a typewriter or a keyboard. And then I wrote
The other one that came to my mind was the keystone in a bridge. So I did
Keystone
nearly
in-
write
yeah.
a story about a collapsing bridge.
that would be good. And then and then I wrote down just break a key off in the lock, which was sort of where this one got started. But it is the fun that you can have with prompts, isn't it? You can really go in different directions.
I briefly flirted with like a techno thriller idea of like a digital key. Well, I think that might have been too close to work for me and Nick. So I sort of backed away from it quite rapidly after having the idea.
IT wizards at work, eh? Right, well, we've had some excellent stories, a bit of chatter, but the episode is drawing to a close, and this is our penultimate episode of season 2 before we go for the finale next week, and then on to season 3 with some more guests that we've got lined up, and it's all very exciting.
Exciting people coming.
It's very exciting. But before we do that, so Brad Rawlinson, who's been our guest today, is a very, very successful person on YouTube. And go on, Brad, tell people about you and where they can find you.
Well, I have a couple of YouTube channels that I'm currently working on. My actual job is an editor for a successful YouTube channel, so I'm trying to do the game on my own as well. So there's a channel where I do editing and visual effects, which is just called Brad Rawlinson. It's the most unique and interesting of names. And then I also have a gaming channel, which I stream on occasionally, which is just called Overdog, Ovahda. Oh my god! I've got it written down, and I said
right at the end of the podcast, you did something illiterate.
Ovahda.
Also, written on the screen in front of you, Brad. It's your username on here as well.
Okay, go on, take that again, and we'll.
I don't mind you leaving that in. I don't care.
Spell it for them so they know how to find you.
Ovahdawg. I've also got Twitter and Instagram, but you can find those links in the descriptions of the YouTube videos. I can't really be bothered reading them out.
And that is why you are a billionaire.
Sometimes Nico and I do turn up in Brad's streams as well. So if you're looking for more of us chatting shit, yeah. Well, it's been absolutely excellent having you boys back, and
thank you for rejoining us so far into the journey. You're there right at the start for us, and really great to have you back and celebrate quite how far we've come. Thank you, guys.
No, it's lovely. I'm glad it's going well, guys.
Absolute pleasure to be back.
And if I ever come back again, I promise I won't do Eldritch/Cosmic Horror next time.
If I come back again, I will.
Thank you all for joining us on this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast on your chosen service so that you don't miss out on future episodes.
You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, where you can talk to us directly and even suggest prompts for upcoming stories.
If you're not a tweeter, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram as well. Just search for The Tiny Bookcase.
Now, if you want to support the podcast,
And we'd really appreciate it if you did.
you can do so at patreon.com/The Tiny Bookcase.
And then you could be just as special as these story seekers.
Do we thank them?
I think so.
Well, then it's a huge thank you to the legendary Matthew McLaren and the absolutely epic Scott Byrne
For their support.
Thank you for listening. Catch you next week.
Next week. Make it slimy.
Make it slimy, Nick.